Sourdough bread is special. It's made with a sourdough starter. This starter is a natural leavening agent. It's a mix of flour and water that ferments over time. This fermentation process gives sourdough its unique flavor. It also creates the airy texture that sourdough bread is known for. Baking sourdough bread may seem intimidating, but it's a great project for beginner bakers. It teaches patience and observation. It also allows you to connect with the food you make on a deeper level. The process of making sourdough bread is simple. You mix flour and water to create a starter. This starter ferments and develops a tangy flavor. You then use this active starter to make your bread dough. The natural yeasts in the starter create air bubbles, giving the bread its texture and rise. Making a sourdough starter is easy. All you need is flour and water. You mix them together and let nature do its work. The natural yeasts and bacteria in the air will start to ferment the mixture. To make your starter, combine equal parts of flour and water in a jar. Use a clean jar and non-chlorinated water. Stir well to combine. Cover the jar loosely with a cloth. This allows air to circulate. Place the jar in a warm spot. Over the next few days, you will feed your starter daily. This means adding more flour and water. This feeding process provides food for the yeasts and bacteria to grow. Your sourdough starter needs regular feeding. This keeps the yeasts and bacteria alive and active. Feed your starter once or twice a day, depending on its activity and the temperature of your kitchen. To feed your starter, discard about half of it. Then add equal parts of flour and water to the remaining starter. Stir well and mark the date on the jar. You want to see bubbles and signs of activity. This means your starter is alive and healthy. The exact amount of flour and water you use for feeding can vary. Start with a 1:1:1 ratio, that is, equal parts of starter, flour, and water. A healthy sourdough starter is bubbly and active. It will rise and fall predictably after feeding. This indicates that the yeasts are alive and working. Your starter may take a week or two to become active. Don't worry if it takes a little longer. Once your starter consistently doubles in size after feeding, it's ready to use for baking. Before you use your starter, it's a good idea to perform a float test. Drop a small spoonful of starter into a glass of water. If it floats, your starter is ready to bake with. Section 5. Your first loaf, mixing and kneading the dough. Now it's time to bake your first loaf of sourdough bread. This is an exciting step. You'll combine your active starter with flour, water, and salt. Start by mixing your active starter with flour and water. You can use a stand mixer or mix by hand. Add salt towards the end of the mixing process. Salt can inhibit yeast activity if added too early. Once the dough comes together, turn it out onto a lightly floured surface. Knead the dough for about 10 minutes. Kneading develops gluten, which gives the bread its structure. Section 6. The first rise, patience and observation. After kneading, place your dough in a lightly oiled bowl. Cover it and let it rise in a warm place. This is called the bulk fermentation or first rise. The first rise can take several hours. The exact time will depend on the temperature and the activity of your starter. During this time, the dough will double in size and develop flavor. You can check the dough's progress by gently pressing it with your finger. If the indentation slowly springs back, the dough is ready for the next step. Section 7. Shaping your loaf, a gentle touch. Once the dough has risen, it's time to shape it into a loaf. Gently turn the dough out onto a lightly floured surface. You want to handle it carefully to avoid deflating the air bubbles. There are many ways to shape sourdough bread. You can make a simple boule or round loaf, or experiment with different shapes like petards or baguettes. For your first loaf, a boule is a good starting point. To shape a boule, gently fold the dough over itself a few times. Then tuck the edges underneath to create a smooth, taut surface. Section 8. The second rise, anticipation builds. After shaping, place your loaf in a proofing basket or a bowl lined with a floured cloth. Cover it and let it rise again. This is the second rise or final proof. The second rise is crucial for developing the final texture of your bread. It allows the dough to relax and the gluten to further develop. This results in a lighter and airier crumb. The second rise can take anywhere from 1 to 4 hours. The dough is ready when it has almost doubled in size and feels airy when touched. Section 9. Baking day, from oven to table. Preheat your oven to 450 degrees Fahrenheit or 232 degrees Celsius. Place a Dutch oven or a baking stone in the oven while it heats up. You want the baking vessel to be very hot. Carefully remove the hot Dutch oven from the oven. Gently transfer your proofed loaf into the Dutch oven. Score the top of the loaf with a sharp knife or a lame. This creates vents for steam to escape during baking. Cover the Dutch oven and bake for 20 minutes. Then remove the lid and bake for another 20 to 30 minutes or until the crust is golden brown and the loaf sounds hollow when tapped on the bottom. Section 10. Troubleshooting, Common Issues and Solutions. Sourdough baking can be a learning experience. Here are some common issues and solutions. Flat loaf. This could be due to underproofing, inactive starter, or overkneading. Make sure your starter is bubbly, your dough has risen sufficiently, and you haven't overkneaded it. Dense crumb. This could be caused by underfermentation or improper shaping. Ensure your dough has fermented long enough and that you've shaped it tightly to create surface tension. Sourdough taste too strong. This can happen if your starter is overly acidic. Try discarding more starter during feedings or reducing the fermentation time. Remember, practice makes perfect. Don't be afraid to experiment and adjust your technique. Every loaf is a learning opportunity. Section 11. Conclusion: The joys of sourdough baking. Baking sourdough bread is a rewarding experience. It connects you to a long tradition of bread making. The process may seem detailed, but it's actually quite simple. With a little patience and practice, you can bake delicious and beautiful sourdough bread at home. Enjoy the journey and the delicious loaves that come out of your oven. Happy baking!